lighting, man. Sorry. Working out mine. Oh, Lord. Good morning. I'll get better at this. Right, said Fred. Violence and the use of it. Or not, as the case may be, and various scenarios. And weighing that utterly against being a Christian. And what Christ taught us, and then how we human beings behave in the here and now, in our lives, the only time we have, our 70 years and 10, 70 years and so on, whatever. And David, very kindly, commented at some length on my film God's Prophecies, where I dive into Isaiah and speak of the lamb laying down with the lion and so on, or I merely reference what Isaiah prophesied. That's all I am, quite frankly. I'm none of this is new. I mean, Isaiah, I think, is more 750 years before Christ. For instance, Christ obviously was in the world physically as an actual human being some 2,000 years ago now, a little bit more. And so I looked it up, the Great Commission, and of Matthew, book of Matthew, the Gospel of Matthew, and Christ says, go forth and baptize the whole world and so on, and bring them God's word through me, and do as I've done. And that's it. This rod of iron question, I looked that up. The only reference I could really find was Psalm 2. So ruling with the rod of iron. And there's millennianism and millenniarism or something. And one, millennianism, is associated with Christians through Revelation chapter 20. And then David, SPL Isaac, good old David. He's got my little grey cells at it again. Well, thank you very much. That's what interests me in life, quite frankly, how to get one's head around the world in which we live. The 2 commandments, obviously. Trouble is, if I go this side, which I'm happier at, the lighting goes to pot. But anyway, I haven't got another candle on the other side. The candlelight's rather gentler. Can't see how ugly the world is. Indeed. Right. Now, mouton, as they say. Well, no, I have not got the answers to everything. The classic question remains, this wild and woolly individual person turns up and for whatever reason wants to steal all your goods and rape your wife and kill your children and steal all your goods. in whichever order. Well, that is the real world in which we live. Apparently, at the moment, it's going on left, right, and centre in Ukraine, Russia, for heaven's sake. Digging into that a bit more, to try and improve my historical perspective on the situation. Ukraine has been very much an invaded territory going back, I think it's 32,000 years. They found some sort of evidence of human life there. And then if we scroll on to Anno Domini after Christ, invading, and then the lands are very fertile apparently, but invading hordes from the north and various empires through into the second millennium, and then much more recently, since 1917, the Russian Revolution, it sort of got subsumed into Russia, and there have been various governments and thises and that's, and Poland was in there with its empire at one earlier point, encompassing Belarus as well, and so on. So there's a close association with Poland and Russia, and the Crimea, I think, has been in contest too, also. And so it's very much a question of, over the preceding 1,000 years, seemingly, just on my scanty knowledge of these things, that poor old, the area now constituted as Ukraine, has had a very checkered past. And it is going on now. The invading hordes are coming, and apparently the Russian brutalities are being committed. Zelensky was at video conferencing the United Nations now yesterday. As usual, I've missed out on I used to do it regularly, but anyway, it is now Wednesday, the 6th of April 2022, the week before Easter. Doesn't time fly when you're having fun? So he's pointing out the brutality and atrocity and so on committed by the Russians, but my sense is that they're sort of taking revenge on earlier decades, if not centuries, of troubles. There were the Cossacks too, I understand, and they're from the Don Basin, which is, I think, the fertile basin. So there's the River Don. My history knowledge of this is very scanty, but I believe they were very brutal. So that would have been, as it were, indigenous, what is now constituted as Ukrainian territory, being brutal. And there was White Russia, and I've never understood all of that either, and the Bolsheviks and Red Army, and it does seem to be an awful lot of brutality, quite frankly, sort of resurfacing every so often. I mean, throughout European history, the Romans were appalling too, so, you know, and then there was Genghis Khan's before Christ, isn't he? Right, so an awful lot of violence around. If we bring that to the particular, well, I live in northeastern corner of England now, Alnwick, Northumbria, but England in general, or the whole of the British Isles. Ordinary citizens, there's a very strong sense that, apart from the obvious necessity of the likes of farmers and so on having shotguns, and regulated use of rifles for deer hunting and the like. But the general population are absolutely not to be armed. That is the responsibility of the state. And that's pretty Europe-wide, I think. I think there's probably rather more arms knocking about in Europe. We had, it was Hungerford, I think, this youngster got hold of a gun or guns, and I think it was 16 people were killed. That was our big event. But we seem to get these events in America all the time, quite frankly. It's almost not news anymore that some person goes doolally and for whatever reason let's rip with serious arms and kills any number of people. And this whole idea that the Trump supporters are Christian and they're all armed and advocating the way Trump behaved with these mother of all bombs that was used, which must have caused massive collateral damage, that is, the killing of innocent civilians. Well, if you take them and bash their brains out physically against the fence post, that's Rwanda. I'm afraid I've heard of that. Sri Lanka's bubbling away. Tamil Tigers, young girls of 15 were brainwashed, if you like, into carrying a bomb under their clothing and being suicide bombers. Yes, obviously I understand the argument that if someone is threatening personally, my own family now is no longer, so yes, I have been married with a child, but that situation no longer exists personally for me. My son is gone. He committed suicide at the age of 18. He'd be 29 now, Robert Francis, so I don't have direct personal anything like the idea of my own family being threatened, but I mean, I can understand that if you feel you and yours are threatened, well, clearly the instinct would be to defend yourself, obviously, with whatever means came to hand. So again, I've stated absolutely clearly, I mean, I've got an old spade in the backyard. Well, would I take a swing at the person who was about to shoot the hypothetical wife and children of mine as a Christian? Again, I've stated it absolutely clearly. For me, myself, if you look at the Gospels, Christ, apart from the overturning of the moneylenders' tables, there is absolute peace from Christ. And epitomized by the phrase, if they strike you on one cheek, turn unto them the other cheek. Every single hair on the head of your fellow man, woman, and child is precious and special. He doesn't actually say, it doesn't say woman and child, but that's me trying to be inclusive in the age in which we live. So I add that. That isn't in the Gospels. It's just, anyway, every human being is precious and special. So that leaves this classic argument of someone is threatening for whatever reason, and in the times we live in now, not the millennial times. Well, I think quite clearly those have not arrived for what it's worth. Millennial times, we'd know. Sorry, I'm going off now, but there's also this question of 144,000 It's all in the book of Revelation. I think that's all chapter 12, the elect. And I'm just a simple little old soul. That 144,000 troubles me. The Jehovah's Witness latch onto it particularly. Because it, to me, is sort of saying that there will only be this 144,000 at the end times who are somehow especially chosen, which opens up all sorts of, as it were, cans of worms. Who are they? To me, Christ's message is for all of mankind, all 7.89 thousand million of us, every single human being. And the message is from Christ: if they strike you on one cheek, turn unto them the other cheek. Every single hair on the head of your fellow man, woman and child is precious and special. So we're back to this position which is real in the world now, especially in Ukraine, Russia, but it's going on in Syria, for heaven's sake. We don't hear about it. Yemen, the Horn of Africa is also bubbling away. Sudan, I think, there's still trouble there. And many other places that situation does exist. What do you do? If I just say no violence, Christ says no violence, therefore you just stand by and watch your wife and children raped and murdered. Brilliant, or not brilliant, as the case may be. Well, it seems actually once you're in that frame of spirit, you actually want particularly to rape the man's wife in front of him. That's what these people do, youngsters. Somehow to show more, whatever that's showing. Well, you'd probably be restrained anyway at that point. They'd have you tied up. I simply will not accept. I mean, the logical extension of someone threatens your wife and children, right, so you say, well, let's get together, chaps, let's get some arms, and if that lot come over here threatening our wives and children, then we'll kill them first. Well, then you've got a war. Well, that's exactly the world we live in. So we're never going to rise out of the mess then. So, no, I'm sorry, that cannot be a Christian argument, a Christian position. No, I'm sorry, David. I'm not in that position. So in that regard, I'm pontificating. Hypothetically, I would allow my wife and children to be raped and killed in front of me. That's what I'm saying, isn't it? Personally. Given a choice. I'm a big, strong chap. Would I? I've got 2 staffs in here. Would I take a swing at them? Probably get shot in the process. In Christ's time, the Romans were behaving brutally all about Christ. Throughout his ministry, the iron fist of the Romans was evident in throughout the Roman Empire. And it is absolutely clear that Christ did not go down the route of getting an armed, he specifically says this, did I have an armed, when they came to arrest him in the Garden of Gethsemane, band of brigands, as it were. No, he says, I was in the temple teaching your religious leaders. So no is the answer. How do we get from what we have now, the world as it exists, which is essentially on its path to Armageddon and self-destruction, bigger arms, bigger bombs, obviously nuclear weapons now, flashier, smarter weapons, bigger battleships, etc., etc., more of them. And those in power prepared to use them in self-defense. Well, Russia's argument, to some extent, I can see. The NATO countries have been advancing eastward for the last 50 years or less, 30 years. I mean, when I was young, it was just sort of, Europe was kind of France and Germany and Italy and Spain and Holland, and we joined England, Britain and so on, and the rest of it. And then I was abroad for a while, and I came back and suddenly there were 27 countries in the European Union. So from the Russian perspective, so the satellite states, they call Estonia, Latvia, and so on, had come into the European sphere of influence. I'm not a politician. I'm not in the position where I have to decide to use weapons or not. Major aggressive use of military force. I would not put myself in that position. I would not wish to make that decision, ever. My sorrow, I am British, I am a Christian, but I am British, is that this country of mine, Britain, through the centuries, has behaved appallingly in terms of its treatment of indigenous peoples. We've turned up and taken over. The colonial behaviour of essentially a purportedly white European Christians is utterly appalling to indigenous peoples through the centuries, everywhere. No, I'm a simple old soul. I am a Christian, and to me, that is just not the path to go down. Who knows what you may or may not do in extremis with someone actually there in front of you, physically raping your wife and killing your children. So one would understand at that point that you'd snap and respond physically with violence. Yes, I could fully understand, obviously. But it's the extension of that that's the problem. To preempt that, if you then gather together in militias, armed militias against the other lot, and then you extend that a bit further, and then it becomes nation states, and one gobbling up the other, and this empire builder and that empire builder, that is the history of mankind. And as far as I'm concerned, Christ has come into the world 2,000 years ago blessedly, I have this wonderful faith. Just as a complete tangent, I was very fond, as obviously so many people were, of jolly old Terry Wogan, the Radio 2 DJ and presenting the Eurovision Song Contest, and his way about this being chatty and pleasant and so on. But I have just looked him up, and something I simply didn't know, he was essentially an atheist. Well, how sad. Einstein was an atheist, or at least an agnostic. How utterly tragic. One of the most iconic scientists who've ever lived, Einstein, with all his knowledge of the depth and power of the universe, and he still couldn't conceive of God, whereas seemingly the most humble peasant ploughing in the fields and so on knows that you have to fertilize the land, the rain must come, the sun must come, it's obvious, and have an instinctive empathy with nature, but also really to God, to a greater being, and therefore be open. My background is to some extent, well, I was born in South Africa, so I'm actually a white African, i.e. amongst African black people, South African black people, but empathizing with black peoples anywhere, if you like, more because it's my background. And they have this wonderful, sort of simple, joyous relationship with God through Christ, brought by us lot, the European missionaries, of whom I've got an answer. This is a right old ramble, this one. I haven't lost the plot entirely. I do know what the theme is. The theme is no violence under any circumstances ever. In my understanding of all of Christ's teaching, he did not teach us to go forth with hatred in our hearts and kill the other person. Essentially, the two positions are utterly irreconcilable. The world as she now is, with the leaders by and large, especially the big superpowers, America, Russia, China, Britain's much more in the background now, Japan, the Philippines, and so on and so on. These huge, India obviously, these huge populations adopt the position of Northern Korea. That's why Kim Jong-un, or whichever one he is, the son now, wants to show off his nuclear weapons just so he gets some attention. Probably not sort of intending really to ever use them, but to demonstrate that in fact he now has the technical capacity to send an intercontinental ballistic missile with a nuclear warhead to America. Oh, then he'll get listened to, maybe. That seems to be And that path is exactly what is leading us to Armageddon. That's my take on these matters. If you shuffle through the arguments from the particular, your wife and children being threatened with rape and death, through to communities, states, and so on. Well, from my position as a Christian, a single man now of 65 years old, I can only, in the calm and quiet of this lovely little place I've got, state categorically that, I mean, I've already indicated no violence. If people were brought up with love in their lives, how does, no doubt Hitler was a little boy playing with other children and just grew up. I don't think he had a particularly abnormal childhood. And how does that transform into someone who wants to... He latched onto this 1,000-year thing too, that Germany was going to rule the world. Well, I think people just get confused. I'm no expert, but I am not confused about this. I don't know all the ins and outs of the centuries. Looking at millennialism, it's been... In the first century, they thought Christ with the second coming would happen. Virtually after he ascended to heaven the first time. And then you go through in the sort of 200s, those early fathers of the church and so on. And I am no expert at this. But there's been an awareness of millennialism through the book of Revelation especially. And that Psalm 2, that's the strongest reference I could find that David referred to this rod of iron thing. But that's through God's grace. God's going to intervene. What God does is God's path. He is all-powerful, all-seeing, and to be feared by us humans. Christ's teaching is utterly clear. There is nothing within the Gospels there is actually Luke. After the Last Supper, I think it's Luke chapter 22, Christ says, take 2 swords. I've never quite got my head round that. You've got 2 swords, well, you might actually use them. Overall, I'm absolutely clear that any path, as we live in the day-to-day world now, which is inclined to the use of physical violence against another human being, has to be anti-Christian. So anyone advocating that, as far as I'm concerned, is being anti-Christian. Christ's message, as ever, relies on the 2 commandments. Love God, love your neighbour as yourself. To anyone who's managed to get through all of this ramble of mine. I seem to ramble best at night, don't I? What to me is now the morning. Amen. Love is the answer. perish the awful thought of ever being placed in the position where your wife and children are physically threatened. I mean, what's going on now in Ukraine, the images are awful. I've actually also stopped watching it, quite frankly. Tanks and stuff all blown up and bodies under carpet in the streets and so on. Love is the answer. Christ's message was, as far as I'm concerned, utterly focused upon love. Love God. Love God. Love your neighbour as yourself. Amen.